Um, today we're pleased to have two guest speakers, and our first one is Adriana Bankston, and here she is, and she's in that box there, so you can all wave to her. So we invited her. This was at the request of Adam, so you can thank Adam partially for this. And Adam had seen some of her postings on science policy in research advocacy, and he had suggested we invite her. So here she is. And I'll tell you a little bit about her. So she has a PhD in biochemistry, cell and developmental biology from Emory, and she received that in 2013. And then she went on and did a postdoc at the University of Louisville. And then until 2016, then she decided, and we'll hear about the motivations for this, but she decided to take a really different track in her career. And I think that this was in part due to taking one of these individual development plans. At least that's what she told us. And she realized that she was really interested in policy and research advocacy. And so she made this complete kind of career change from being a bench scientist. And so her website is here, and I think we sent it in an email. And she is also on the board of directors of a nonprofit called Future of Research. And she'll tell you about that. And this is, the advocacy and policy part of what she's doing. And so that's really kind of cool. So we'll hear first from Adriana, and then we're going to hear from Dr. Brett DiPaolo, who is from KSU Physics. He's a professor and department head there. And he's going to tell us about his year being a Jefferson Science Fellow at the State Department. So this is a National Academy selected fellows that work in the State Department, so in DC, and they serve as kind of high-level consultants for the government. So we'll hear more about that after Adriana. So anyway, Adriana can take it away.
Great, thank you. Let me see, I think. All right, so thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you, Adam. I'm very happy to be here and talk to you about future of research and sort of my transition from the bench. And feel free to stop along the way. I try to sort of incorporate things that were from the questions that you guys asked. So, but feel free to stop at any point. So, as Loretta said, I'm currently on the board of directors for Future of Research, and this is basically to preface this by saying that this is not a paid position, but it's a very good way to sort of transition into the nonprofit and policy world, which is quite a fascinating combination as well. So at Future Research, we think a lot about the scientific workforce, and there's been a number of papers on this stating that the scientific workforce has grown over the years, especially with the doubling of the NIH, and obviously that most biomedical research is funded by NIH, and so the number of people in science have grown over time. And however, at the same time, there is a declining interest in academic careers from PhD students. So this is a paper here that came out fairly recently showing that there's a reduced interest in academia, and also this particular bar here, which is 25% of PhDs that were later on in their career basically lose interest in academia. So there's obviously a less PhDs who are staying in academia. And so the question is, and this is something that we think about all the time at Future Research, is how are we training the next generation? And this is sort of the traditional model of, your mentor sort of works with you and you end up going to academia. There's industry and potentially other things, although this is, again, didn't used to be very developed. And so the best consortium basically proposed a model to incorporate different things into training, such as career development, IDP, by the way, it's right here. Mentoring, not only by your PI, but also your peers and also alumni coming back and giving talks. Also, getting experience sort of outside of the lab and professional development in different ways. And in this way, you're basically able to sort of transition into different careers, and here's just a few of them here, and here's science policy. So for sort of generally, I wanted to just give you a few resources that have been really useful to me. So here's Versatile PhD. So this one has resources for both STEM and also humanities and social sciences, but it's a good way to sort of look at what careers exist on both sides. Beyond the professoriate, it also has a lot of online training webinars that you can watch. And they also actually have a symposium coming up, I think in May, that you can register for. And then my IDP, which is, as Loretta said, also kind of the way I started. So I took the IDP while I was a postdoc, and policy was #1, and I had no idea what that was. So then I started that's sort of where my journey started. And I'll tell you more about that later, but definitely it was useful. Imagine PhD is also similar to IDP. It's for humanities, but also actually has a lot of very useful resources too, including a job board and interviews with people who went into different careers. So even if you're not interested in humanities, it's still a good tool to sort of explore your career with that way. So it's very good. And then a bunch of societies here that I've listed that have a lot of resources. So this is a plug to say that you should get involved with your professional society. I've been involved with ASCB pretty much since I was a grad student, and it's been a really good resource also for career development. ASBMB also has a lot of resources. AAAS, obviously, they have a career development portal and webinars for things like how to talk to Congress and things like that, the budget and other things. So, and FASEB also has a really good list of policy fellowships as well. So definitely scientific societies have been very useful. So just to switch gears now, what do you think about, particularly in science policy? So I'm going to be using this paper written by Yvette Seeger, who is the head of the FASEB Science Policy Office. And so I encourage you to read this. It's very dense and very well written. So I'm just going to highlight a few points from here. So sort of thinking about science policy in general, is either you can think of it as doing science for policy or policy for science. So science for policy is basically using your science to influence public policy in different ways. And policy for science, obviously, it's what it says, but it's basically thinking about how policies can influence the practice of science. And this is sort of where future research falls into. And so policy can be done at various levels. So you can think of it, as I said, professional societies, think tanks, universities. We're interested in university policies as well. Pharmaceutical and biotechnology companies also have a lot of times a branch of policy, and also federal and state governments. So this is just to say that science policy is kind of hard to define because it's kind of all over, and you can do it at different levels. And so in terms of the skills, I would say you already have a lot of skills from your PhD in terms of project management, thinking critically, data analysis, things like that. So anything that shows that you can complete a project, troubleshoot, publish, and all those things are important in policy too. But there are sort of 3 things that came out of this publication from Yvette that were highlighted in terms of things to be developed for policy. And communication to different audiences is #1. So this is obviously, as a scientist, you're not used to talking to the public or policymakers. So thinking about the audience that you're talking to. Also building consensus among different stakeholders. So if you're going to build a policy, it will require you to basically talk to patients, policymakers, all sorts of different groups to kind of build something that is going to be comprehensive and useful to all the groups. And so consensus is tough, but it's also a very useful thing to think about when you're building policies. And networking, obviously, I know that's probably something everyone tells you, But it's really sort of the way that I've transitioned. Also, networking has been extremely useful for me to figure out what policy is and how to do it. So one question I thought would be useful to sort of think about is, how do you even know what the policy issues are? So, and again, all of these things I've sort of done along the way, being aware of what's around you. So I guess put a plug for social media. A lot of the people that I know or sort of met in policy or through Twitter. And, you know, I went to conferences and met certain people that were in policy, which is very useful to sort of follow up and then build a relationship with those people. And, you know, that sort of builds up on itself over time. In just engaging in policy discussions, again, Twitter is very good for that. But, you know, just calling somebody and saying, you know, what is your job? So I've done a lot of informational interviews. Just with people in policy to see kind of what their day-to-day job is like. Writing is also a big part of policy, so I've written a lot of blogs, as Adam mentioned earlier. And so anything that you can do to write about your work to a different audience is very useful. And other sort of more formal discussions, if you have or if you don't have, I would encourage you to start a policy discussion group. You know, you can, if you really want to sort of think about particular issues, you can call your representatives and say, this is what I think about this issue. And this is actually came from this article down here by Chris Pickett, who was a fellow ASBMB. And he wrote a very nice article about, again, how to think about transitioning into policy and how he did it too. So that's also a very good resource. And then, of course, policy fellowships, if you can get one, which is really sort of the golden ticket to that, but there's also other ways to do it that we can talk about later. And I just wanted to bring up this point too, that policy is, in my view, sort of a very hot topic right now. So a lot of people sort of want to go into it. And so the way to sort of set yourself apart is to find something that you're really passionate about and show that you are committed to a path in policy and you're excited about that particular thing. And just make your voice heard in any way that you can. You know, write about it, go tweet about it, go to meetings, present posters, all sorts of ways. So there's any way that you can sort of get your name out there is very useful. And then that'll sort of help you think about how to gain experience as well. And again, these things sort of kind of feed up on themselves. As you start doing more things, you'll be involved in more things that lead to more things, if that makes sense. So just starting somewhere. And this is a really nice quote from Chris Pickett, which is essentially where the title of my talk came from, that when he transitioned into policy, said, you know, I don't know what I want to do. And once he found something that he really was passionate about, he said, I'm just going to commit and see what happens. And this is basically what I've done too. So this quote says, commit to finding out what you're passionate about and do it by getting your hands dirty. You can read about jobs and careers all day long, but you never will find if a path is the right one unless you try it. And then once you commit, you will basically sort of be on the path that will probably lead to a good place for you. So I've been asked to also talk about some people who have transitioned into policy. I've already mentioned a couple, and I'm obviously biased here, but so I just want to highlight Gary McDowell, who is the executive director of Future Research. So he was a former postdoc and essentially decided to start this organization out of sort of a desire to help junior researchers, and we're all sort of on board with that idea. But just to show you that somebody who's junior who wants to make a difference is doing that. Chris Pickett, again, is sort of similar. So he, as I said, went through the ASBMB fellowship. Now is running this organization called Rescue Biomedical Research. And it's also sort of a similar focus, although he's thinking more about the systemic issues of hypercompetition and other things. And he's also a great resource. And then Jessica Polka, who basically, I guess I should preface this by saying, so she's also the president of Future Research, but she runs BIOL, which is another group that came out of the Rescue Biomedical Research. And this is basically promoting preprints in biology. So again, here's 3 people that have sort of taken it upon themselves to change policies around things that they believe are important, and they're not too far off from you in terms of, you know, they did postdocs, or they sort of went from grad school to something else. But just to show you that young people can make a difference, and you know, I encourage you to follow all of these people. So, okay, now switching gears a little bit to talking about my own career path and sort of how I got involved with the Future of Research. So starting over here, I was born in Romania, actually. And so I did my education there, went to high school, which was very science heavy, and then moved to the US after with my dad, and then got my BS from Clemson, which is right here. During that time, I was had no idea about policy until recently, so this is not going to come into play yet. So I was actually pre-med. I thought, oh, I'm going to go to med school. I got into this summer research program here, LSU, so I went here and then basically did research because I thought it would be good for my CV, and oh, I'm going to get into med school because this is going to help. And then along the way, that basically sort of started down a path of thinking that I actually really enjoyed research. So I went to grad school, got my PhD from Emory, which is right here from Atlanta. And then the research that I was doing sort of was led to the project that I ended up doing in my postdoc. So I moved to Kentucky, which is very different. And this is where I really started thinking about my career and whether I wanted academia or not, and started exploring different paths. And so long story short, because of this sort of exploration, I ended up looking at what resources existed for postdocs at the University of Louisville. So there wasn't a lot, so I actually ended up starting this seminar series called Craft, just to bring in speakers to talk about careers. That was obviously very useful for networking, but also got me into sort of the idea of how we're training scientists today, and do they have the resources that they need. And this is really sort of where everything started. Then I got more interested in sort of connecting scientists to each other. I organized a symposium right here around membrane trafficking, which is my field at the time, and was sponsored by ASCB, and was a very nice sort of regional meeting to get people together to talk about this field and sort of network and talk to scientists who are at different levels. And then I got more involved nationally with other groups. So National Postdoctoral Association right here, which was really thinking about postdoc issues more broadly nationally, which is starting to become an interest to me as I was a postdoc and sort of aware of the policies that affected postdocs at the university. And before that, I had also been involved with ASCB, which has a committee for students and postdocs. And so we organized a lot of professional development programs at the annual meeting. And it was a really great group to sort of be on, because that basically showed you that having a committee of young people kind of doing things within a society was really great. So I guess I always try to put in a plug for ASCB because they do a lot of stuff for young scientists. So after that, again, now I already sort of had an interest in how we train scientists and what policies affect them and what's happening at the national level. So in actually the last month of my postdoc, I went to a Future of Research meeting in Boston, right here, which is basically thinking about how are we teaching scientists to advocate, basically. They know how to do science advocacy. And this is sort of where things started with Future of Research after that. And that's about when sort of the nonprofit was starting up. So it was sort of just a very smooth transition. So now I'm just going to tell you a little bit about what we do. So Future Research arose basically out of a desire to contribute the voices of junior researchers. As I said, a lot of times we think that young people in science don't necessarily have a voice, or they're not being heard really, even when they're on committees or boards, things like that. So this is a paper that came out in 2014, kind of thinking about generally what's happening in the scientific enterprise, the hyper competition, the fact that there's not career resources, the way the funding is distributed doesn't always really help the junior investigators and so on. So it's a very good sort of overview of a lot of the issues in the scientific system. So following this, basically a group of postdocs and students of postdocs in Boston decided to get together and discuss it and sort of get their views out there in terms of what the junior people think about these issues. And this is sort of how things started. So here's just a few pictures of the way these sort of meetings happened. So we used Post-it notes and sort of try to get people to say what they think about different issues. And so we had this meeting and wrote a paper, which was not on this one, but it's still, I think, one of our best papers that we published from Future Research. Again, just getting the ideas of young people out there on these topics. So after that, something happened that I don't think we really expected, is that more people said, oh, this is cool, we want to do our own meetings. So we had a bunch. And so here's just some of the ones that have been happening around different topics. So this is the one about advocacy that I mentioned. There was one about mentoring recently. This one was also in Boston about sort of getting early career researchers in leadership positions. And there've been a couple in Canada. So people really started to sort of get together and discuss these things. And so because of this, it was sort of obvious that this is sort of a national issue that people wanted to get involved in and do something about it locally. So we decided, why don't we just make an organization for that? And so 2016 became a nonprofit, and basically our mission is to represent junior people and sort of get them involved in grassroots advocacy to organize their own meetings and discuss these things, try and promote change in the system. And really we want to get them talking about these issues. And this is very very transparent. So we all sort of put our stories out there. We've all had all sorts of stories about academia. We talk about things that people don't necessarily talk about a lot of times, or they don't want to, or they're afraid their PI might find out, and other things. So it's just sort of very transparent about what's happening in academia and how it affects young people. So our mission currently is to basically champion, engage, and empower early career scientists with evidence-based resources to improve the scientific research endeavor, which basically means we want to involve people in sort of making a change in the system. Oh, and I should also mention that we're funded by the Open Philanthropy Project. So also, what do we actually do? So what is science policy research? I think was one of the questions that somebody asked. So in terms of this organization, we basically, again, we have these local meetings. We've done also workshops at national meetings and locally. And then we also try to collect institutional data to look at the landscape of policy in particular aspects. And I'll give you a couple of examples after. So we have meetings, we write them up or present a poster, write a blog post or a paper, things like that, and sort of try to sort of influence policy by saying this is what young people are thinking and this is what needs to change because it's not working, things like that. So these publications are sort of trying to make that as well. We try to create resources based on that and come up with an actionable plan, and basically the entire thing is sort of be really transparent about the data that we have. So all the data we have is usually on our website. And we also have this collection here from F1000 Research where we put all our slides and all the publications and presentations that we give so people can use them and see what we're doing. So, and this presentation is actually already there. So more broadly then, we advocate for a number of different things, but really sort of comes down to getting early career researchers in leadership positions, thinking about where they're going, data about career tracking, where's the workforce going, how are we training scientists, are we training them for independence, and what does that actually mean? How is their mentoring, is it happening, are they being mentored or not, and how that needs to change, how the funding needs to change. Again, we advocate for sort of more fellowships to encourage people to be independent from their PI and sort of have a more independent career path. But again, there's also issues of who's eligible for fellowships and things like that. So open access, most of our publications are open access. We publish a lot of preprints. So we also advocate for that. And also being inclusive in science, which is a lot of, we advocate for women in science, underrepresented minorities, international scientists, and so on. So it's really sort of everything that you can think of to sort of improve the system. So I'm just going to give you 2 examples of projects that I've been involved in. So as I said, I've been involved with future research since September 2016. And at the time, there was this policy called Fair Labor Standards Act. So it's a federal labor law that basically mandated that postdoc salaries be raised to a particular amount, without going too much into detail. But we basically, this stems from the fact that we think that postdocs are underpaid. And so this law would basically raise the salaries to $47,476 per year. So we decided to email HR departments from over 300 schools and find out whether they were going to do that. So here's what the data looks like. This was basically showing that at the time, 51% were raising the salaries, 41% still hadn't decided. And so we basically checked most of the schools that we got responses from. There was also an injunction that was filed a little while after this that basically allowed universities to cancel the raise. And so some of them actually did that, as you can see here. This is an online resource that we built following that to put basically all of the universities on one website and sort of record what they responded to us. And you can see a snapshot of that here. So the idea, was very powerful for 2 reasons. One is that we sort of found out what institutions could tell us, what they were going to do, and so sort of made everything very transparent for putting it online. But also putting them all sort of together is meant to be used as a sort of peer pressure, if you will, saying that this university is going to raise salaries, and so it's going to be hopefully influence where the next generation goes, because if you treat them well, they end up going to that school. But at the same time, it's sort of trying to influence the ones that were going to cancel the salaries to change their mind, which actually happened for a couple of them. So again, this is sort of a way to try and make change to encourage institutions to do good things, because some of them are, so then all of them can do that. So again, being very transparent about this, which again, money is not something that you really talk about in academia, so we're trying to change that. And the other thing, which is sort of related, is thinking about postdoc titles, which obviously it's not something that I honestly thought I would ever study. But I think it's fascinating, honestly, that there's, this is a blog post that was written by Gary, that there's actually 37 names for postdocs across the US. And this makes it really hard to count and track where they're going, because they're called all sorts of different things. And so we requested, following the FLSA, we requested actually salaries for postdocs to give us basically the actual amounts. And I didn't show you that today, but basically they also gave us postdoc titles. And that was interesting in itself, in thinking that what you call a postdoc is going to determine what salary they have, and whether they're generally kind of around 48,000 or so, but you know, there's some that basically is very low and very high. So it's kind of a fascinating question to think about, the fact that postdocs across the country are called all these different things, and that actually affects what they get paid, which is quite a cool project. So we're still continuing with this, and this is just one of the things that I've sort of been involved in with future research. So that's all I have. So I just want to thank Gary McDowell. He's really, as I said, started this whole thing, you know, out of a desire to help change the system, and we're all on the board with that. We have an amazing board of directors who are all basically doing this by volunteering, but you know, it's been a great experience. So I encourage you to follow us on Twitter and Facebook. We have this is our website here, futureresearch.org. This email address, we haven't quite set up the the email system, but if you email info@futureresearch.org is a good way to basically get on our email list. We send newsletters every month, and we, as you might imagine, do all sorts of different projects that I described. We're on Twitter. This is our Twitter handle. This is Gary. This is mine from Twitter as well. And obviously just get in touch with us. If you have questions or want to get involved, we always have projects that we want people to do. So, all right, that's it.
Thanks.
Questions for Adriana? Okay, Emily.
Can you hear me?
Can she?
Can you hear Emily?
Can you hear me? Yes.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering, like, when you're fighting for things like higher pay for postdocs, which is obviously important, like, what kind of, do you see trade-offs and, like, if you're increasing some money, is there a trade-off that you're seeing in these institutions that seem taking money away from else? Or like, yeah, or fewer of them, fewer postdocs.
Yeah, that's a hard question. It's actually hard to know. This is another problem, but it's actually very hard to know how many postdocs there are because of the different titles, and also where they go. We also published another paper that was looking at this problem, that basically there were institutions who were reporting postdoc numbers to the NSF that were totally off. Something like from one year to another, there was like 200 postdocs, and then the next year they disappeared. So there's still this issue in institutions of people can't really track where their postdocs go. So there's, you know, the postdoc situation is, I mean, for us, it's sort of an interesting question coming from the fact that we were postdocs, but again, sort of studying the postdoc situation is interesting because there's so many things that are unknown, and it's a good model to sort of find out what institutions can tell you in terms of data. So whether they're willing to give you the data, whether it's accurate, whether it's new or old, or, you know, how old is it, and how much do we really know about, you know, trainees in institutions from them. So it's been an interesting project, and still, I think there's still a lot of things we don't know about postdocs. So there's a lot to be done.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So when you're talking about the postdoc salaries, can you do something similar to find out about grad student stipends and how that varies across the country? Or are these online and more accessible than postdoc salary information? Because I think there are huge disparities there. And I think for K-State, our graduate students, it's probably 28,000. Yeah. So ours, yeah. So these, for K-State, and I think probably the same thing with physics as well, right? It's probably 28,000 for grad students. Shush, really? Well, it even varies from department to department. So what can you tell us? Can you then take it to the next level for grad students?
Yeah, we haven't looked at that. So there's a website called phd-stipends.com where people have input their salaries. There's actually also a postdoc one now, postdocsalaries.com. They try to sort of, again, increase transparency on people putting in their salaries there. We haven't done this analysis. I imagine that it would be probably easier to get than postdoc data, but again, it still comes down to what institutions will give you. So I don't know whether it's harder or not.
You could put pressure, just public pressure on some of these institutions. So some of my colleagues from South Dakota, I think the grad student stipend is like 13,000 or something. I mean, and it's almost, criminal that they can ask a student to commit to research at 13,000 a year. I don't know, maybe it's not that bad, but
It is.
It is.
It's about 13,500.
okay, so there we go, 13,000. So that's half of what our students get. But it just seems to me we're doing a terrible disservice. Anyway,
This
so
whole
what can you do about that?
how much people are getting paid, it's been an interesting question because it sort of depends on what people will tell you. So I'll tell you for the postdoc salaries, we filled out freedom of information requests, which is basically, it's public information you're requesting, so they're supposed to give it to you. And so we got all sorts of amounts ranging from like 10,000 to 100,000. So it's really hard to know what that is actually, because when you ask for the full salary, if they send you something like $10,000, there's no way a postdoc gets paid that much. So we actually went back and confirmed with the institution that those lower amounts were additions to their annual salary. So for example, it could be a supplement to fellowship or things like that, which they don't really tell you. They just say, here's the number. So then you have to sort of investigate what that means. Yeah, there's, I guess there's a lot of variations. Again, also depending on the title. One thing that it's not really accounting for is cost of living, which it should be, but obviously the NIH scale is the same all over the country. So that's another consideration and we've been asked to sort of extrapolate the data to see what it would look like in terms of cost of living. So that's probably something we'll do eventually. But that's a huge problem that basically the scale is all the same all over the US. And these things are not taken into account. And I'm sure that the data the institutions send, again, the question is what did they send you? Did they actually send you salary or is it something else? So again, because grad students, I guess it may be easier because they're all grad students, so there may not be as many titles for them, but the postdoc problem is, it's worse because of that, because of all the titles they're under. And you can't really tell who's a postdoc, so it's.
So more questions.
I had a question, Adriana. So you were saying that you discussed science policy through Twitter, which kind of surprised me. It seems kind of superficial. And related to that, so you get all these data, which is really valuable, but when you do policy towards universities or hopefully towards politicians as well, do they really care, or can you really get it across, or how do you get it? Because it seems now and then that they don't really care about the data anyway.
Yeah, so I mean, convincing policymakers is very dependent on what they care about, and that was actually a good point made in one of the sessions that I went to when I was a postdoc, that politicians will care about things based on their personality a lot of times. So sometimes it's like, some people like numbers, other people are like, oh yeah, I like personal stories, and if you tell your story, they'll be more motivated by that. than by data. But we, at least at Future Research, we believe that data is important and can make a difference, and that, you know, we're scientists and we're trying to convince people based on the numbers and say, you know, look, you know, 80% of postdocs are underpaid, right? And so that's really the only way to do that, is to be transparent and put that out there and show them what we find. So in terms of Twitter, I would say it's been very useful for sort of following people who are in policy. You know, there's a lot of AAAS fellows, people at different levels in policy. And it's also very kind of a useful initial tool to say, like, oh, I'm going to follow this person. And then, you know, you connect with them on LinkedIn and call them up. So it's a good way to start a relationship. And the other reason I think it's good is because you can see what they're talking about on Twitter. So what are the sort of the hot topics? So when a policy comes out, for example, recently there was a report coming out from the national academies and the next generation researchers, and that was sort of all over Twitter and everyone discussing that. So when there's sort of new stuff coming out in terms of our interests related to academic policies, federal policies, in terms of trainees, those things are going to be all over Twitter. So that's not the only way to do it, but it's a good way to start to kind of build, find out what's out there and what people are talking about, and then you can sort of follow up one-on-one and build relationships with people from there. So it's been very useful, in my opinion.
Thanks.
Okay, well, let's give Adriana another hand.